Abraham Lincoln is widely known as someone who helped to end slavery in the United States, officially at least. Although the truth of that is debatable, what is far less well known about Lincoln is his contribution to economic theory, possibly because that contribution would have been as welcomed by the 1% of his day as it would be welcomed by today's 1%. For it was Lincoln who refused to give the private banking system their first real chance to hold his country to ransom by letting the bankers finance the American Civil War. He chose instead to use a monetary system managed entirely by the government, a system based on something which came to be known as the greenback dollar, a fiat-based currency unit that would pay for the war without incurring any of the crippling interest charges that the private bankers would demand. Lincoln was so impressed with his greenbacks that he wanted to make them a permanent part of the US monetary system. But he was murdered in suspicious circumstances before he had the chance to pass the necessary law. He was clearly troubled by the growing power of big business in America, even in his day, for it was Lincoln who said this: "I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will surely follow." 16 presidents later, F.D. Roosevelt's concerns were very similar to those of his illustrious predecessor. For he said, "The liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than the democratic state itself. That, in its essence, is fascism. Ownership of a government by an individual, by a group, or by any other controlling private power." There's nothing new about tiny groups of rich people running governments. It's the oldest and most long-lasting form of government there has ever been. However, that isn't democracy, and that's the key point that needs to be made very clear. Most British citizens basically trust their elected leaders. They're vaguely aware that nearly all of these trusted leaders invariably profit very handsomely from their time in power, and some folk are aware that these profits are not always honourably acquired. But nevertheless, most British citizens would never believe that their trusted leaders would ever do anything deliberately to harm their own country or their own people. Therefore, they reason, the trusted but possibly shady characters who run our country can be left alone to continue as they have always done, because surely their hearts are in the right place. Obviously, this situation suits our rulers perfectly. One of the sad consequences of this, however, is that most British citizens do not understand that those they think are running the country, the people they think can be trusted not to do them any harm, are not in fact running things. Their purpose is simply to create the illusion that they are in charge, to trick trusting voters into thinking there's nothing to worry about. Well, the unpleasant truth is that these great trusted leaders are not in fact in charge, and there's a very great deal to worry about. The average citizen has absolutely no idea how pervasive the corporate business world has become in the way government conducts its affairs and makes its decisions, nor how sinister the situation is. Privatisation of our public services, which we the public used to own, was initially sired, birthed and nurtured during the Thatcher governments, and lovingly developed into maturity by Blair's New Labour. Privatisation is now on the verge of achieving in Britain the frightening level of destruction of our public services that is already achieved in the home of its role model, the United States. The White House, which has for many years been providing more political leadership and influence over British lives than our own elected representatives, has itself been run by giant American corporations for many decades, just as Lincoln and Roosevelt feared would happen. It's therefore hardly surprising that after almost 4 decades of slow erosion, this system of total elitist control has now assumed critical proportions here in the UK too. Originally sold to the British people as the means for providing modern and efficient public services, the reality of privatisation has been the private theft of public assets on an unprecedented scale, as well as the theft of billions, possibly trillions of pounds from ordinary citizens, and the all but total destruction of the caring and compassionate state that had just begun to evolve following the Second World War. This talk is very severely critical of corporations. By corporation, I mean most very large businesses, usually, but not necessarily, with shares traded on the stock market. If there was just one vital issue that differentiates a corporation from any other business, apart from its size, It's clearly stated in the words of Professor Joel Bacon when he talks about the corporation's legally defined mandate to pursue relentlessly and without exception its own self-interest. Mr. Bacon's excellent book, The Corporation, is essential reading on this vitally important subject, as is George Monbiot's superb Corporate Takeover of Britain, Captive State. Although these books are both quite old now, the dangers they describe are not only just as relevant today, the dangers are even greater. The sinister effect of the legally defined mandate that Bacon talks about is vitally important to understand, because some corporations use it as an excuse to justify the most grotesque excesses of behaviour, from massive environmental destruction to institutionalised criminality in financial services, to the greatest abomination human beings are capable of perpetrating: permanent war. Whereas many small and family businesses used to routinely practice quite humane and ethical principles and still manage to make a very comfortable living, such precious concerns are entirely lost on corporations, which are expressly forbidden to practice them unless they can be used as a cynical marketing device to increase profits. The legally defined mandate of corporations to maximize profit is quite literally their license to kill. Because the British government is so obsessed and bedazzled with the way American government works, it's worth taking a closer look at this dubious role model and considering in some detail the incestuous relationship between American corporations and their government's decision makers. Consider first the individuals who are elected to government positions. Their election campaigns are hugely expensive and must be financed by someone. Today, it's reasonable to say that US politicians spend more time raising funds to keep themselves in power than they do serving the ordinary people who elected them. The superb journalist Matt Taibbi, for example, noted that around the 1970s, Congress convened for 162 days a year, but in 2006, it sat for a mere 93 days. At first glance, that might seem that these people don't do very much. But Simon Hoggart, a British journalist who worked in America for The Observer for over 4 years, explains how they do spend their time. These days, congressmen, some of whom spend up to 4 hours a day in fundraising, do not generally vote as their constituents would wish. They vote in such a way as to raise money in order to be able to claim that they have voted as their constituents would wish. When a corporation steps forward with its blank checkbook, it's on the clear understanding that if a particular candidate is elected to office, that corporation will have its man in government, and he better remember who put him there. Not that he is ever likely to need reminding. President Bill Clinton, for example, could furnish us with a convenient example. According to John Pilger, in 1996, the American representative of the World Trade Organization, Mickey Cantor, complained that Chiquita Bananas, the American banana multinational, was the victim of discrimination by European tariffs, which allowed a trickle of slightly more expensive, organically grown Caribbean bananas. The fact that banana imports from the Caribbean amounted to just 7% of the total was immaterial. The complaint was sufficient to cripple imports of the fruit from Grenada, which, being a major part of the island's economy, was catastrophic. The day after Cantor made his complaint, $500,000 was donated to the Democratic Party for the Clinton presidential campaign from one Carl Lindner, the billionaire controller of Chiquita. In his excellent book Web of Deceit, the British writer Mark Curtis gives another example. The US company Cargill, the world's largest agribusiness corporation, reputedly wrote the first draft of the United States government's negotiating position on agriculture, which turned into the World Trade Organization's agreement on agriculture. America's elected leaders danced to the tune of big business from the very outset of their careers. The well-known British journalist John Snow, who could hardly be described as a pinko liberal, covered the 1984 presidential elections and made the following observation. If my affection for the United States system was to take a battering, it was from the role money played in securing the nomination. Candidate after candidate put himself in hock to moneyed interests, from food retailers and oil prospectors to trades unionists. The American government operates with a well-established network of lobbyists, thought to number at least 10,000 accredited professionals. Lobbying could reasonably be seen as a euphemism for legalized bribery. Operating on the instructions of hugely wealthy businesses, lobbyists remind elected representatives where their real loyalties lie, by persuading members of the government to make decisions which will generate more wealth for the sponsoring businesses. Naomi Klein, author of the superb books Shock Doctrine and No Logo, says this: according to the New York Times, the top 20 service contractors have spent nearly $300 million since 2000 on lobbying and have donated $23 million to political campaigners. Those who don't understand how the game is played might wonder why big business appears to be so very generous to politicians. Well, Ms. Klein continues. The Bush administration, in turn, increased the amount spent on contractors by roughly $200 billion between 2000 and 2006. This represents something like a 300% profit on investment for those contractors. As far as they're concerned, what's not to love? Writer Bill Bloom noted the following incident in one of his excellent anti-empire reports. 7 members of the House of Representatives steered hundreds of millions of dollars in largely no-bid contracts to clients of a lobbying firm, PMA Group. In fiscal year 2008 alone, the 7 lawmakers sponsored $112 million worth of earmarks, which are construction and other projects paid for by the government, for PMA clients, while accepting more than $350,000 in contributions from the firm's clients and lobbyists. Given that these clients received about $300 from the government for every dollar they paid to PMA, it's pretty obvious why people employ these so-called lobbyists. The total control of government by corporation boardrooms is now almost complete, a situation which, by Roosevelt's widely accepted definition, would constitute fascist government. Once we, the 99%, accept the situation as normal, instead of a self-inflicted submission to slavery, the process will have achieved its ultimate goal. The writer and filmmaker Michael Moore puts it like this: in the end, we'll be pledging allegiance not to a flag or some airy notion of freedom and democracy, but to the dictates of Citigroup, Exxon, Nike, General Electric, General Motors, Procter & Gamble, and Philip Morris. It is their executives who now call the shots, and you can go vote and protest and cheat the IRS all you want to get back at them, but face it, you are no longer in charge. Not that you ever have been, it must be said. But the really cynical thing that's happening here is the illusion that's fabricated to conceal it all. 200 years ago, people knew they lived under tyrants and had no lawful means of producing political change. Today, most people living in the first world countries think they're living in democracies, where they have ultimate control over politicians and could, if they wanted to, control what their politicians do. They're wrong. The average British voter, for example, has as much power over her elected politicians as she has control over the changing of the seasons or the tides of the sea.